They laughed when Natalie placed her hand on Brandon's arm. Not because she looked happy, because everyone in the ballroom knew she was still married. And the man standing alone near the back wall, the man in the old charcoal suit with tired eyes and quiet hands, was the husband she had already erased. A few guests pretended not to notice him. A few stared too long. But Ethan did not move. He stood there in silence while his wife introduced another man as her future. And when she looked at him, she did not look ashamed. She looked relieved, as if the room had finally corrected a mistake. What Natalie did not know, what Brandon did not know, what none of the smiling faces in that room knew, was that the poor husband she had spent months humiliating had become the sole heir to a private estate worth more than $200 million just 9 days earlier. But this is not a story about revenge. It is a story about what people reveal when they think you have nothing, and what happens when the man they threw away decides he no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. To understand how Ethan ended up standing in that ballroom, watching his marriage die in public, while holding a truth powerful enough to change every life in that room, you have to go back 7 weeks. 7 weeks earlier, the hospital room smelled like antiseptic, boiled tea, and the lavender lotion Ethan always rubbed into his mother's hands before she slept. The curtains were half open. Rain pressed softly against the window. And in the chair beside the bed, Ethan sat with a Bible in one hand and an unpaid bill folded in the other. His mother, Margaret Hale, had not spoken much that afternoon. Her breathing had become thin. Her voice, when it came, sounded like it had to travel too far to be heard. "You should go home," she whispered. Ethan smiled without looking up. "I am home." She tried to smile back, but her eyes filled first. He set the paper down and adjusted her blanket. For 11 days straight, he had barely left that room except to shower at the hospital gym, answer calls in the hallway, or bring coffee back for the nurses who treated his mother more kindly than some members of his own family had. He had spent nearly all of his savings keeping her comfortable. Not because he was reckless, because he could not bear the thought of her final weeks being measured by what insurance refused to cover. Ethan had never been a flashy man. He owned a small restoration workshop on the south side of the city. He repaired antique furniture, church pews, hand-carved cabinets, old tables people were ready to throw away until he made them beautiful again. The business was steady, but never glamorous. It paid the mortgage. It paid the utilities. It paid enough to help his mother. It did not pay enough to impress his wife. Natalie used to say she admired his hands, said they looked like the hands of a real man. Hands that built things, hands that worked, hands that made her feel safe. But admiration can rot when it has to live too long in the shadow of comparison. And comparison had entered their marriage the day Natalie started spending more time around Brandon Dane. Brandon was polished where Ethan was plain, loud where Ethan was restrained, expensive where Ethan was careful. He wore watches that looked like declarations. He parked ambition in every conversation. And every time Natalie came home from one of Brandon's networking dinners or charity galas, she looked at her husband the same way people look at an old phone after seeing a newer model. Not angry, just disappointed. The first time she said it out loud, she didn't even lower her voice. "You're a good man, Ethan," she said, standing in their kitchen while he washed the same coffee mug for the second time because he was too distracted to notice. "But good is not the same as enough." He turned off the tap. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm tired," Of what? Of always being the strong one in public. Of pretending we're building something when we're just surviving. Of smiling through dinners where people ask what you do and I have to explain it like it matters. He looked at her for a long time after that. Not because he didn't understand, because he understood too well. "What did Brandon promise you?" he asked quietly. Her face changed for a second. Just a second. Enough. "This isn't about Brandon." That was how he knew it was. People often confused Ethan's quietness for weakness. That was their first mistake. They thought because he did not argue loudly, he did not see clearly. Because he did not brag, he had no pride. Because he carried pain without announcing it, he must not have felt it deeply. But Ethan had spent his whole life learning that noise and strength were not the same thing. His father had died when he was 10. At least that was what he had always been told. His mother never liked questions about the past. She answered them with kindness, but never with detail. There was no bitterness in the way she raised him, only discipline, faith, work, dignity. She taught him that if a person wanted to know who you were, they should watch what you do when no one is clapping. That lesson stayed in him longer than anything else. So when Natalie began coming home later and smiling at her phone more than she smiled at him, he did not explode. When she began criticizing little things, the dinner plates, the curtains, his truck, his shoes, the neighborhood, the guests he invited, the life they had built, he did not beg. And when her younger sister accidentally let something slip over lunch one afternoon, "Brandon says Natalie deserves a man who can place her in rooms that matter." Ethan did not react in front of her. He simply paid the bill, went back to the hospital, and sat with his mother in silence. That night, Margaret opened her eyes and studied his face. "She has already left," she said softly. Ethan swallowed. "I know." "Then stop holding the door for someone who is already outside." He bowed his head. "I made vows." His mother's fingers tightened weakly around his wrist. So did she. 3 days later, Margaret died just before sunrise. The nurse closed her eyes. The room went still. And in that stillness, Ethan felt something inside him break so quietly, no one else would ever know when it happened. The funeral was simple, because that was what she wanted. No gold programs, no expensive flowers, no dramatic speeches. Just scripture, hymns, and the handful of people who had seen the real Margaret Hale. Strong, giving, disciplined, and impossible to embarrass. Natalie wore black and stood beside him, but she looked restless the entire time. She checked her phone twice during the burial. When he noticed, she didn't look guilty. She looked inconvenienced. That was the day something final settled in him. Grief has a way of removing illusion. You stop negotiating with what is clearly broken. You stop begging people to become who they already chose not to be. After the service, while relatives drifted toward their cars and the cemetery workers stood respectfully at a distance, an older man in a navy overcoat approached Ethan with a leather document case in his hand. "Mr. Hale?" Ethan turned. "Yes?" "My name is Charles Bell. I'm an estate attorney. I've been trying to reach you privately." Ethan frowned slightly. "I think you have the wrong person." The man looked at him carefully. "No, I don't." He handed him a sealed envelope. Your mother instructed that this be delivered only after her burial. Ethan stared at the envelope for several seconds before taking it. On the front, in his mother's handwriting, were 6 words. When you are ready, read alone. He did not open the letter until that night. The house was silent. Natalie had gone out, saying she needed air. Ethan sat at the dining table, where so many quiet meals had become quiet disappointments, and slid his thumb under the flap. Inside was a handwritten letter and a legal summary. He read his mother's pages first. If you are reading this, my son, then I am finally free from the fear that telling you too soon might put you in danger. There are truths I kept from you, not because I doubted your strength, but because I wanted you to grow into a good man before the world tried to buy your name. The man you knew as dead was not your father. Your father was Alexander Vale. He came from a family with old money, private holdings, and enemies powerful enough to turn blood into leverage. When I learned I was pregnant, I left. Not because he did not care, but because the people around him cared about power more than people. He found us once, years later. He promised to build something that would one day protect you if I was no longer here. He died 18 months ago. And now, with the final conditions met, everything he protected for you has passed into your name. Do not let money teach you cruelty. If you have inherited anything worth keeping, let it be discernment. Ethan read the last line 3 times. Then he picked up the legal summary. The estate was not a public corporation. It was older than that. Private land trusts, shipping interests, municipal bonds, historic properties. Quiet capital positions in firms that never advertised the names behind them. The total estimated controlled value exceeded $240 million. His hands did not shake. That surprised him. He thought a revelation like this would feel like lightning. Instead, it felt like standing in a room that suddenly made sense. Charles Bell met him the next morning. He explained the rest with the calm precision of a man used to speaking carefully in expensive silence. Alexander Vale had left instructions that no public transfer, no board appointment, no operational disclosure would be triggered until after Margaret's death and a short final verification period. There were concerns about opportunists, Charles said. Ethan almost laughed at the timing. When does it become official? 9 days for control, about 5 weeks for final administrative consolidation. Who knows? A very small number of people. Ethan leaned back in the chair. And what happens if I want none of it? Charles studied him. You can refuse it. Ethan looked out the window. No, he said after a while. I won't refuse what my mother spent her life protecting. But he made one thing clear. He did not want a press release. He did not want attention. He did not want his life transformed in public before he understood what had been placed in his hands. Charles nodded. That was the moment the future changed. Quietly, legally, irreversibly. And Natalie still had no idea. The first time Natalie openly mentioned divorce, she did it while standing in front of a mirror, not looking at him, looking at herself. I can't keep shrinking my life to fit your comfort, she said as she adjusted an earring. I want more. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed tying his shoes. Then say what you mean. She turned. Fine. I'm tired of living like sacrifice is romantic. I'm tired of pretending your potential is the same thing as success. I'm tired of defending a life I didn't imagine for myself. He finished tying the lace. And Brandon? She exhaled. At least he knows how to move forward. That sentence should have ended in shame. It ended in relief, as if she was happy the truth no longer had to dress itself politely. Within a week, she moved into the guest room. Within 2 weeks, people started talking. A photo surfaced online from a charity rooftop event. Natalie in silver. Brandon beside her, his hand low on her back. Her face tilted toward his like she had already forgotten what vows sound like. Friends stopped calling Ethan out of concern and started calling out of curiosity. He answered almost none of them. He spent his mornings at the workshop, his afternoons with Charles and the estate transition team, and his evenings going through his mother's things one careful box at a time. Old church programs, recipes, a watch that no longer worked, a small wooden jewelry case with a brass clasp. Inside it was a folded note. Never chase those who measure worth by spectacle. Build where truth can survive. He carried that note in his coat pocket for the rest of the month. Then, one Thursday evening, Natalie placed a folder on the kitchen counter. "We should handle this cleanly," she said. Divorce papers. Prepared. Organized. Cold. She had requested the house. Most of the savings. No support obligations toward him, and no liability for workshop debt. It was a document written by someone certain they were leaving a man with nothing. He read every page slowly. Then he signed the acknowledgement of receipt. No argument. No theatrics. No desperate speech about what they once were. Natalie looked almost irritated by how calm he remained. "You're not going to fight this?" Ethan closed the folder. "Not tonight." "What does that mean?" "It means I see you clearly now." She crossed her arms. "You think silence makes you noble." "No," he said. "I think honesty would have made you kind." That was the only sharp thing he said to her the entire month, and it stayed with her longer than shouting would have. 28 days after Margaret's funeral, Natalie attended the Ashcroft Renewal Gala on Brandon's arm. Ethan only went because one of the estate's foundation advisors asked him to observe quietly before his formal introduction to several private boards. The irony would have been funny if it were not so cruel. The event was held in a restored hotel ballroom lined with chandeliers and soft gold walls. Donors, developers, board members, elected officials, social names. The kind of room where money tried to dress itself as virtue. Ethan wore one of the only suits he owned. Brandon wore ownership. Natalie wore victory. That night, she did something even Ethan had not fully expected. She introduced Brandon as the man she was finally building a future with. Not privately, not accidentally, publicly, with laughter around her, with champagne in her hand, with half the room listening. There were polite smiles, a few startled glances. 1 or 2 people recognized Ethan standing nearby and looked away out of embarrassment. Brandon, smooth as ever, lifted his glass and said, "Sometimes life requires the courage to choose alignment over history." Natalie smiled at him like he had said something profound. Ethan stood still. That was the scene everyone in the room would later remember differently, because most of them thought they were watching a man be humiliated. What they were actually watching was a room full of people unknowingly standing inside the jurisdiction of his future. Not his revenge, his responsibility. One older woman from across the room studied him for a moment, then walked over. Her name was Hannah Sloan, chair of the Vail Heritage Foundation. She had not met him before, only seen a private file. "Mr. Hale," she said quietly, extending her hand. "I was told you might attend." Ethan shook it. "I was told to observe." A faint smile touched her face. Observation is often wiser than introduction. Her eyes drifted briefly toward Brandon and Natalie. I imagine this is not an easy evening. Ethan followed her gaze, then looked back at her. Easy things rarely reveal much. That answer told Hannah everything she needed to know. 3 days later, she requested that he join the executive review session personally. If loud men understood paperwork, they would fear calm people more. Brandon's company, Dane Urban Advisory, had spent years securing prestige contracts through layered partnerships and polished public language. It looked clean, profitable, untouchable. But estate reviews are not impressed by appearances. Within the Veil portfolio were multiple properties, cultural grants, and redevelopment trusts that indirectly flowed through committees Brandon's firm had touched over the last 2 years. Nothing illegal on the surface. But several renewals depended on board confidence, discretionary continuation, and performance benchmarks that had never been examined closely because previous trustees were elderly, passive, or preparing to retire. Ethan did not storm into the boardroom. He asked questions. Simple ones. Why had costs risen while community outcomes fell? Why were 3 subcontracted firms tied to the same inner network of consultants? Why was a cultural preservation site budgeted at triple its comparable restoration value? Why had neighborhood commitments been reduced while executive fees expanded? He did not accuse. He requested audits. That was enough. Within 10 days, 2 contracts were paused. Within 14, 1 property review was escalated. Within 3 weeks, Dane Urban Advisory lost a flagship redevelopment advisory extension worth tens of millions in future positioning. Brandon called it politics. It wasn't. It was scrutiny. And scrutiny is dangerous to men whose success depends on no one reading the fine print. Natalie noticed the change before she understood the reason. Brandon became harder to reach, shorter in tone, more irritable. Then one afternoon, she arrived at his penthouse to find him in shirt sleeves, phone pressed to his ear, pacing. "No, don't tell me it's temporary," he snapped. "I want names. Who triggered the review?" He stopped when he saw her. His expression shifted, but not enough. After the call, she forced a laugh. "Bad day?" Brandon poured a drink he didn't offer her. "Internal nonsense." "What kind of nonsense?" He hesitated. "The Veil side." Natalie frowned. "What does that have to do with you?" Brandon took a sip. "More than it should." That was the first crack. Small, but real. Natalie had built her decision around a simple belief. Money chooses direction. She thought a man with more access, more polish, more status, more spectacle would naturally create a better life. And for a while, the illusion held. Luxury dinners, private car service, designer bags chosen carelessly. Rooms where people used her full name with interest instead of politeness. She did not miss Ethan. She missed being admired without having to earn it. What she had never understood was that Ethan had given her something Brandon never intended to give anyone. Peace. Not excitement, not access. Peace. Peace is boring only to people who have never had to rebuild after chaos. As Brandon's business pressures grew, Natalie began seeing the difference. He was charming in public, dismissive in private. Attentive when the room could reward him, absent when there was nothing to gain. He liked beautiful things. He did not know what to do with wounded ones. Meanwhile, word began circulating in circles Natalie cared deeply about. A new controlling heir had formally stepped into the Vale estate structure. Private, reserved, difficult to read, hands-on, uninterested in showmanship. Several people mentioned he had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions in meetings. No one said his name publicly at first. Then one evening at a donor dinner, Natalie overheard it. Ethan Hale. She turned so quickly she almost dropped her glass. Two women near the terrace were speaking in low voices. I heard he's Margaret Hale's son. No, apparently Alexander Vale's son. That's impossible. Not impossible. Confirmed. Charles Bell handled the transfer. Natalie stood frozen. For a moment, the room lost sound. Then it all came rushing back too fast. The hospital. The funeral. The letter she had never asked about. His calm. The divorce papers. The ballroom. Brandon's contract problems. She left the event without saying goodbye. It was late when she returned to the house she had demanded but had not yet legally secured. Ethan was in the study, sleeves rolled up, reading documents beneath a small brass lamp. He looked up when she entered. For one terrible second, she saw it clearly. Not power. Distance. That frightened her more. Is it true? She asked. Ethan closed the folder gently. You'll have to be more specific. She stepped closer. About the estate. About Vale. About all of it. He held her gaze. Yes. She stared at him like she expected more explanation to soften the answer. None came. When did you find out? After my mother's burial. And you said nothing? He looked at her for a long time. You had already said enough for both of us. Her mouth parted, then closed. That's not fair. No, he said quietly. What you did was not fair. She sat down without asking, as if her knees could no longer be trusted. Brandon said the reviews were political. Ethan almost smiled, but didn't. Brandon says many things. Did you do this to him? That question hung in the room like smoke. Ethan leaned back. I ask that the institutions now under my responsibility be examined honestly. If his work could not survive honesty, then honesty did not destroy him. Natalie's eyes filled. So this is punishment? No, Ethan said. Punishment would have required me to center my life around your choices. I didn't. That sentence landed harder than anything else. She looked down at her hands. I didn't know. You knew enough. Silence stretched between them. Then, in a voice smaller than he had heard in years, she asked, Was I really that cruel? Ethan answered with the gentleness of a man too tired to lie. Yes. She began to cry. Not dramatically, not beautifully. Just the sound of a person hearing the truth after months of running from it. He did not move to comfort her. Mercy and access are not the same thing. Brandon did not collapse overnight. Men like Brandon rarely do. They erode in stages. First came the lost extension, then the paused financing relationship, then a journalist's inquiry into consultancy layering across municipal preservation work, then a board resignation from one of his most visible nonprofit affiliations. Nothing criminal was announced, nothing explosive enough for headlines, just enough discomfort to make rooms less welcoming. Brandon called Natalie constantly for 3 days after she confronted Ethan. Then, when she started asking questions he didn't like, the calls became less frequent. When she pressed harder, his tone hardened. When she suggested they should get through this together, he laughed. "We were never building together," he said. "You were accompanying me." That was the moment she understood the transaction she had mistaken for love. A week later, he sent flowers with no note, then disappeared from her life almost completely. Natalie came back to Ethan twice after that, not to reconcile, at least not openly. First to ask whether the divorce could be delayed, then to say she had made terrible decisions under pressure. Then finally, to ask if there was any path forward. Ethan listened to her every time. He never raised his voice. He never insulted her. He never humiliated her back. But he did not open the door she had closed. "One day," he told her, "you may become someone I can forgive without caution. But you are not that person yet. And I am no longer the man who survives on hope alone." She cried again. He let her. Some losses must be felt completely, or they teach nothing. When the final divorce review came, Ethan could have changed everything. His attorneys made that clear. Because Natalie had filed based on assumptions of his financial position before disclosure, because several assets were no longer as represented, because timing mattered and concealment had not been unlawful under estate restrictions, he had options. Many options. He could challenge aggressively, delay proceedings, reframe property claims, expose timelines, request discovery that would drag Brandon's conduct into the record. He asked one question: "What gives me peace?" His lead counsel blinked. "Legally or personally?" "Personally." The attorney hesitated. "Clean closure." Ethan nodded. "Then that's what we do." He signed on terms far kinder than he had any obligation to accept. Natalie kept the house proceeds after sale distribution. She kept the car. She kept several accounts. He did not fight over furniture, gifts, decorative things, or symbols of a marriage that had already turned hollow. When Charles heard, he asked if Ethan was sure. "Yes." "You are leaving money on the table." Ethan looked down at the note from his mother inside the wooden jewelry case. "Then let it stay there." This was the part most people would never understand. Power does not always announce itself by taking. Sometimes power is walking away without needing to strip the room bare. Sometimes dignity is more expensive than revenge. And Ethan had become rich enough, in every way that mattered, not to confuse possession with victory. The first major act Ethan made as controlling heir was not buying a car, not relocating to a penthouse, not hosting a party so the same people who ignored him could suddenly discover his value. He visited the South Side workshop on a Monday morning before sunrise, ran his fingers across the sanded edge of an oak table, listened to the old floorboards creak, smelled varnish, dust, and cedar. Then he called Hannah Sloan and authorized the formation of a community restoration initiative funded through one of the estate's heritage arms. The project would train young tradespeople in carpentry, stone repair, preservation work, and small business discipline. Its first center would be built 3 blocks from the workshop he nearly lost, while people with polished shoes discussed relevance. He named it the Margaret House for Craft and Recovery. The second thing he funded was a grief support and caregiver relief program at the hospital where his mother died. No cameras, no press conference, no giant check. Just a transfer, a plan, and a promise quietly kept. That was who Ethan had always been. Money did not make him noble. It merely removed the excuses other people used to overlook it. As for the estate, he accepted the board appointments that mattered, declined the social invitations that didn't, and kept his old truck 6 months longer than his advisors found respectable. He still dressed simply, still spoke carefully, still left meetings early if there was real work waiting somewhere else. And the more powerful he became, the less interested he seemed in performing power. That unsettled some people. It inspired others. It exposed many. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Ethan attended the reopening of a restored public library, funded in part through the same estate structures Brandon once expected to profit from. The ceremony was modest but elegant. Students, teachers, community leaders, craft apprentices from the new center, a local choir. No ballroom, no champagne tower, no false intimacy, just purpose. After the event, as guests filtered into the courtyard, Ethan saw Natalie standing near the gate. She looked thinner, quieter. Her clothes were still expensive, but now they wore her instead of the other way around. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she walked toward him. "I wasn't sure you'd speak to me." "I'm speaking now." A sad smile flickered across her face. "I heard about the hospital fund," she said, "and the training center. And this." He nodded. She would have liked this library. "Margaret?" "Yes." Natalie looked down. "I think about her often." Ethan said nothing. After a long pause, she asked, "Are you happy?" He did not answer immediately. Not because he didn't know, because he wanted to answer truthfully. "I have peace," he said at last. "That's better." Her eyes filled again, but she blinked the tears back before they fell. "I was ashamed to come." "Then why did you?" She looked around the courtyard, at the children running near the new stone benches, at the apprentices carrying folding chairs inside, at the name plaques and the repaired brickwork, and the life returning to a place that had once been neglected. "Because I needed to see what you did with what I failed to recognize." Those words stayed in the air between them. Ethan nodded once, not in triumph, in acceptance. "I hope you become better from it," he said. She gave a broken little laugh. "You still talk like the kindest person in the room." "No," he said. "I talk like someone who survived losing the wrong things and found the right ones." Then he stepped aside as a group of students came toward him for a photograph. And Natalie understood what her greatest loss had really been. Not money, not access, not status. A man whose worth had never depended on being seen by the world, only by the truth. Some people only know how to measure value when it arrives wearing shine. They trust noise. They trust luxury. They trust applause. And because of that, they miss the quiet people, the builders, the caretakers, the ones who keep showing up when no one is watching. Natalie thought she was leaving a small life. What she was really leaving was a safe one, a faithful one, a real one. Brandon thought influence could replace substance, but scrutiny has a way of exposing structures built for display instead of integrity. And Ethan never needed the inheritance to become a better man. He only needed the truth to stop apologizing for the man he already was. In the end, the greatest reversal was not that the poor husband became wealthy. It was that the people who judged him by what he lacked were forced to confront what they lacked in themselves. Character, discernment, loyalty. The kind of vision that recognizes treasure before the world labels it. If this story taught anything, it is this: never mock a quiet person in a season of hardship. You may be standing in the presence of someone whose real inheritance has not yet been revealed. And when it is, the most painful part may not be what they gain. It may be realizing what you lost by failing to honor them when they had nothing to offer but truth. If you enjoyed this story, tell me in the comments. What hurt more, Natalie's betrayal, or the moment she finally understood who Ethan really was? And if you want more powerful stories about betrayal, dignity, hidden truth, and quiet comeback, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.